I spent the last year reading the weirdest books ever nominated for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and today I'm going to tell you about all of them. Hello, Bookworm. I'm Hannah, and I'd wager that when you hear the words literary book prize, you think of books that are highbrow, slower paced, maybe even a little stuffy. What you don't think of are books with animals solving crime, or aroused mermen and horny angels, or a person reincarnating as a marsupial. And yet, all of those and other weird things feature in these books that were nominated for the Women's Prize over the last 30 years. You see, every year the Women's Prize for Fiction celebrates 16 books written by women, and most of them are very literary. But there's usually one book that's not like the others, and I call that book the outlier. The outlier is the book with an unusual narrator or magical realism. It's the book with a bizarre setting or an absurd premise. It's the weird one, the playful one, and it's the one I usually seek out and read first. So I got the madcap idea to go all the way back to the first year of the prize in 1996 to find and read all of the outliers, even in the rare instances when a long list had more than one. And now that I'm done, I'm here to share them with you in chronological order with the year the book was nominated in the top corner of the screen. We have 38 books to get through, so let's go, starting with this fever dream, The Book of Color by Julia Blackburn, which I can summarize for you in one word. Pigs. Plague pigs, companion pigs, lovers in pig masks, pigs running off cliffs, and books bound in pigskin. Pig symbolism pervades every aspect of this multi-generational story about an interracial family with a troubled past. This is a tale of childhood trauma, madness, and family curses. What I enjoyed most about this book were the swift narrative and the glimpses of vivid imagery. But the disjointed timeline and the unnamed characters made it difficult to follow the story. At times, this book confused me, but it also gave me the impression that I was at the start of a wild literary journey filled with peculiar reads, and I could not wait to explore more. If cooking and supernatural romance are among your favorite things, then you may enjoy The Mistress of Spices by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. This book follows an immortal woman named Tilo, who's trained in the ancient art of spices. She lives in the arthritic body of an old woman who runs a spice bazaar in Oakland, California, where she administers spices as curatives to her customers. She gets much closer to her customers than she's supposed to, which stirs conflict with her supernatural mentor. And when a handsome young stranger walks into her shop, her romantic pursuit of his affections leads her to the most difficult decision of her life. I really enjoyed the first half of this book, though it slowed considerably in the second half. But as someone who loves to cook, I enjoyed how each section of the book was dedicated to a different spice and shows how Tilo uses it to heal members of her community. Give this one a read if you're in the market for a quiet romance with a dash of magical realism and a pinch of Indian mysticism. I want you to imagine listening to an audiobook that sounds like scratched vinyl being played underwater, because that's what Lives of the Monster Dogs by Kirsten Backus sounds like. I have no idea why. Maybe it was just a bad recording, but it effectively made this strange book feel even stranger. Here's the setup. New Yorkers are shocked when a dog wearing what looks like an old-fashioned military uniform arrives in a helicopter. Now, this dog was formerly enslaved in Canada, where he was given mechanical human hands and the ability to speak. He and others like him have arrived to seek refuge in New York. So they build a castle on the Lower East Side, barricade themselves inside of it, and wait to die off because they all suffer from an incurable illness that prevents them from reproducing. Through diaries, newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and by sometimes following a woman named Cleo who's invited to a party inside the castle, we slowly learn about the century of cruel experimentation that led to this race of genetically and biomechanically altered canines created by an insane 19th century Prussian surgeon. Now, it's been months since I finished reading this book, and I still don't know what to make of it, but I can say that if you've ever wanted to read a story about biomechanically altered dogs who walk upright on hind legs, wear glasses, have human hands, and use speech synthesizing apparatuses to speak, then this is the book for you. While I knew that this literary journey would be filled with weird books, nothing prepared me for the absurdity of Ark Baby by Liz Jensen. This book opens 5 years after an infertility epidemic, which has prompted couples to adopt monkeys and apes as children. Some fanatical mothers even go so far as to shave their monkeys and openly breastfeed them. We're already off to a strange start, but things get even weirder from here. We are introduced to a veterinarian named Bobby Sullivan. He's on the run after satisfying a disgruntled husband's request to euthanize his wife's baby substitute monkey. From there, we follow Bobby to a small coastal town where he begins learning about Tobias Phillips, a man described as a Victorian freak who has a direct link to the absurd events confounding Bobby's modern world. In addition to Bobby, we follow a man's efforts to curate Queen Victoria's bestiary, which then leads to the discovery of a ship filled with rotting animal corpses and a decapitated human head. We also oscillate to the past to follow a woman who was held captive on that ship, where primates made for unusually good companions on those long days at sea. Now, I think any one of those sentences uttered about a book would be strange, but the fact that they all relate to the same book gives you some idea of just how absurd Ark Baby is. But I actually enjoyed watching these parallel stories converge in increasingly surprising ways. I found Jensen's writing style punchy and unabashed. It's a Black comedy, so the characters hold nothing back, and their antics actually made me laugh. I think Ark Baby is a little longer than it needs to be, but even so, I'd recommend this book for fans of dark, absurd humor. Some love stories don't play out the way you'd expect, such as the one in The Vintner's Luck by Elizabeth Knox. Set in France in the early 19th century, the story concerns a married vintner named Sobran who falls in love with an angel named Zaz. Now, their love story plays out across decades, with each chapter covering a year of Sobran's life. Most chapters are a few pages long, while others are only a paragraph or a single sentence, hardly enough to convey a complex relationship. The blurb claims this book is compelling and erotic, so I had high hopes for a scintillating read of feathered embraces and bodies meeting in secret amid sun-warmed grapevines. I wanted heat and hedonism, but what I got were a few hesitant kisses and the mere understanding that these men were intimate. A more intriguing element of this book is a subplot about a murder mystery, but even that is just a whisper in the book. Now, if you're one of those Goodreads reviewers who abandoned this book, but you'd still like to know the truth about the murder, you can find the answer in my Goodreads review. Myth and reality merge in The Leper's Companion by Julia Blackburn. Now, this odd little book follows an unnamed narrator who's lost someone she loves. In her grief, she imagines a past in a 15th century village with unusual people where she can both find and lose herself. These people include a leper, a madwoman, a beached mermaid, a shaggy-haired man who lives in a forest, and a woman who eats a map to sate her longing for faraway lands. It's a strange tale of rebirth unlike anything I've read before, but much like her previously nominated work, The Book of Color, I struggled to connect with the characters. On the other hand, there is a drowsy, dreamlike quality to Blackburn's writing that I really admire, so while I wish this patchwork fairy tale had leaned more into the magical realism, I still found it an enjoyable read. Let's talk about a multi-generational family saga that starts out in a magical European forest. If I Told You Once by Judy Budnitz. Budnitz? I hope that's how you say it. Judy Budnitz. The story opens with a girl named Ilana living in a remote Eastern European village where she meets a strange man in the forest. He gives her a decorative egg with a tiny city inside of it, and it plants a seed of wanderlust in her heart. The first third of this book is steeped in fables and fairy tales, and I loved it. It's dark, atmospheric, reminiscent of Angela Carter, and even surreal at times. But when Alana is 16, she takes her egg and runs off in search of a new life, eventually finding her way to New York. And the rest of the book concerns her life in the city and the 3 generations of women that follow. And all the magic just fades away. The book morphs into your typical multi-gen saga, historical fiction that explores family dynamics, specifically between mother and daughter. While that dramatic shift didn't quite work for me, I can't help but wonder if it was intentional. After all, this is a story of cultural displacement, and perhaps that is intended to speak to the sense of magic lost when you're forced to leave your homeland behind. And maybe all of the suffocating motherly love is a nod to the difficult mothers and stepmothers found in fairy tales. I'm not sure. If you've read this book, feel free to weigh in with your thoughts. The protagonist of The Power Book by Jeanette Winterson can write you into a story where you can be and do anything you want if you just send her an email outlining your desires. Her name is Allie, and she develops romantic feelings for one of her clients. The entire book is a mix of her speaking directly to us as if we're her lover, and the stories she writes in which she and her lover continually find each other. These short stories play out in settings from myth and fairy tales, as well as the real world, where biographies are reimagined to include this woman and her lover. It's a fairly quick read that explores themes of love and identity, and includes some philosophical musings as well. The writing is vivid and playful, sensual and unabashed. It's the kind of book that won't appeal to everyone, but if it's for you, you're gonna love it. One time I was in a bookstore and I found Wicked shelved in the children's section. That is not a children's book. You know what else isn't a children's book but could easily be misshelved as one? A child's book of true crime by Chloe Hooper. Don't be fooled by these cute animals on the cover. This is a story about a graphic murder. The protagonist is a grade school teacher named Kate who's having an affair with her student Lucian's father. Lucian's mother recently published a book called Murder at Black Swan Point. It's a true crime story about the brutal slaying of an adulteress set in a nearby town. When Lucian starts using his crayons to draw violent images from his mother's book, Kate worries that he knows too much about his mother's disturbing book, and Kate becomes obsessed with the Black Swan Point murder and draws parallels between what happened to that slain mistress and what she's doing in her affair with Lucian's father. She starts reimagining what happened in the Black Swan Point murder and rewrites the whole case as a children's book with Australian animals as characters solving the mystery. And that story is included in the book, accompanied by Lucian's drawings. Now, this is a book of speculation and increasing paranoia. The ending is weird and difficult to believe. Also, the blurb claims there's escalating eroticism in this book, but no, this book is 5 shades of gray at best. I really appreciate Hooper taking such an unusual approach to telling this story. That said, I really don't know who this book is for. From Lucy Ellman, the woman who brought us the Booker Prize nominated literary behemoth Ducks Newburyport, comes Dot in the Universe, in which a 40-year-old English woman who likes to murder elderly ladies and steal their tea cozies decides to off herself. She spends some time in the underworld where there's a museum to death and also heaps of forms to fill out. Then she reincarnates as a possum who's sacrificed on the altar of scientific study, after which the cycle of reincarnation renews. This darkly comedic little book is peppered with musings about the pointlessness of life, rants about scientists, and a hot take on the American obesity epidemic, among other things. Throughout this book, words are randomly capitalized for no discernible reason. The title cleverly alludes to both the Big Bang Theory that a dot-sized atom blew up to create the universe and how infinitesimally small we each are in the grand scheme of things. Now, I didn't always know what to make of this book, but I admit that it was an amusing read, and my enjoyment was enhanced by the full circle nature of the conclusion that compelled me to go back and read that first chapter again. In 2004, Margaret Atwood predicted our future with Oryx and Crake, the first book in a post-apocalyptic trilogy. Now, this follows a character called Snowman, who may be the last human on Earth. You see, he's on the other side of a global pandemic that was caused by powerful corporations tampering with genetic engineering. The world is now inhabited by spliced animals, snowman, and a bunch of genetically modified children who descended from Oryx and Crake, two people Snowman cared about, whom we understand at the start of the book are dead, but we don't know why. The Snowman travels to a nearby village in search of food, and along the way, he thinks about life before the panty, slowly revealing how the world fell apart and what happened to Oryx and Crake. Now, this book points a huge accusatory finger at capitalistic greed and major corporations' blatant disregard for our limited natural resources. If you like your speculative fiction to hold a few shocking revelations and leave you asking why after you've read the final page, give this one a read. Would you believe me if I told you there's a Women's Prize nominee that's all about poop? Well, it's true. It's called The Great Stink by Clare Clark, and it's set in the subterranean world of Victorian England known as the London sewers. This is a pungent story of madness and murder, uncertainty and buried truths that grows incrementally more surprising with each passing chapter. Now, it weaves factual people with fiction in the story of two men who retreat to the sewers for very different reasons. Now, one is a war veteran named William May, who finds solace from his PTSD in the sewer's dark, quiet passages. And the other is a scavenger called Long-Arm Tom, who gathers rats from the sewers with the help of his faithful dog, Lady. A violent murder in the sewers disrupts both men's lives and entangles them in a mystery of Dickensian proportions. The closest thing I've read to this book is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. It's a book that takes its time telling the story and paints everything in vivid detail, from the characters and their desires all the way down to people's excrement bobbing in the river. And much to my surprise, this book wound up being one of my favorite books from this reading journey. And if it sounds even remotely interesting to you, I highly recommend giving it a read. I freely admit that I DNF'd Beyond Black by Hilary Mantel. Of all the books longlisted in its year, it sounded like the most unusual and odd nominee, and like something I would want to read. It's about a woman named Allison who works as a medium alongside her flint-hearted sidekick, Colette. Together, they tour the commuter belt towns of London, passing on messages from the dead. And the blurb says that behind Allison's smiling persona is a desperate woman. The next life holds terrors that she must conceal from her clients, and her own waking hours are plagued by the spirits of men from her past. Reviewers describe this book as deeply disturbing, darkly comedic, and excruciatingly funny. I gave it 50 pages, and I wasn't seeing much in the way of spirits. I couldn't visualize the characters, and there hadn't been any humor, so I DNF'd it. But if you've read this book and you feel like I abandoned it too soon and am missing out on something spectacular, please let me know. If you enjoy distinct character voices and bittersweet romance, then you may want to read a concise Chinese-English dictionary for lovers by Shulo Goa. This is about a 23-year-old Chinese woman whose name no Westerners can pronounce, so she just goes by Z. While spending a year in London, exploring the city and learning English, Z falls for an Englishman. Their relationship initiates Z's journey toward self-discovery, in which she finds that love doesn't mean the same thing in the West as it does in China, and that even when you and your partner speak the same language, you may not understand each other. Now, what makes this book unique is the first-person narrative voice of Z. At the start of the book, she speaks in a rough, broken English with lots of little misspeaks woven in. But over the course of the novel, as she continues to learn, her English improves so that by the end, she sounds fluent. Everywhere that she goes, she carries with her a little Chinese English dictionary so she can look up words that stump her. And each chapter starts with a word and its definition, which then leads into the narrative. I'll admit that the romance in this book made me fidget because Z is young and vulnerable, and the man who takes an interest in her is 20 years her senior. There's also a portion of the book where she tours England that made me so uneasy because she goes there alone, pretty much only talks to men, and says yes to every guy who asks if she wants to see his van full of puppies. How is this woman still alive? But aside from that, this book is beautiful in its sensuality, and Z's relationship with her partner is a gorgeous portrayal of the divide between culture, language, and love. We have just arrived at what I think is the most bizarre book in this entire video, The End of Mr. Y by Scarlett Thomas. What even is this book? It's like 3 different books merged into one philosophically laced sci-fi romp through a book lover's wet dream, okay? Let me break down the 3 types of stories that comprise this novel. The first is a story of a woman named Ariel who's fascinated with this rare book called The End of Mr. Y. It's believed to be cursed, and no one alive has read it because everyone related to the book has mysteriously disappeared. But then Ariel finds a copy of it in a used bookstore and risks trying to understand what makes this book so dangerous. So this can be shelved in your books about books category on Goodreads. This is the part of the book that captivated me. The second story it holds is a highbrow foray into complex philosophical and scientific concepts like absolute truth or quantum physics. These characters often discuss things like time travel paradoxes or explore the question, what is consciousness? These characters will have just survived a near-death experience in a realm outside of reality, and they'll stop to have a long-winded conversation about Einstein or to participate in a thought experiment. And for me, these portions of the book felt pretentious and insufferable, but I do appreciate how they play a crucial role in the story at large, including the title, The End of Mr. Y, or The End of Mystery, which alludes to the central theme of questioning and deconstructing established truths. The third story is essentially The Matrix, because Ariel's interactions with the book lead her to a place called the troposphere, where she can travel through time and space and meets a god disguised as a mouse and other weird things. Even though this wasn't a me book, and I often felt like the author used 1,000 words where 20 would do, I keep thinking about it because I've never read anything else like it. This next book really slept on its weirdest elements. The Russian Dream Book of Color and Flight by Gina Oshner is set in post-Soviet Russia and centers on the people living in a crumbling apartment where a man fell from the roof and now his ghost lingers at the building, heckling the living. Now, one of the characters is a woman named Tanya, who's kind of like a grown-up Harriet the Spy. She carries her journal with her wherever she goes and records her observations and dreams in brief yet lyrical passages. Tanya works at a museum that holds a collection of art knockoffs made from things like chewing gum and foam or popsicle sticks and tomato juice. The museum director hears of a mysterious American group looking to fund art in Russia and enlists Tanya in convincing the group to fund the museum where she works. There's also a woman named Olga who works as a translator for a newspaper called The Red Star, where she's forced to churn out propaganda or alter the truth to make it more palatable. Now, Oshner is adept at crafting detailed, believable portraits of characters, but there's very little ghost heckling in this book. And the business with the museum and the American funding is very late in coming. The blurb suggested this would be a ghostly bubblegum jaunt through a quirky museum and an apartment full of misfits. But with so much in the book being a facade and the characters fighting against censorship, this wound up being a depressingly topical book. So let's move on. The setting of this next book is giving Manderley from Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters takes place in a 200-year-old Georgian house with crumbling masonry and gardens choked with weeds. One day, the family living inside the house calls upon Dr. Faraday to treat one of their servants, and he later comes back to begin regular treatment of the war veteran who lives there with his mother and sister. Strange things start happening at the house, like things disappearing when a person's back is turned, or black marks appearing on walls and ceilings, along with scratched words, and furniture moving inexplicably. Each of the characters have their own theories about whether the house is haunted or infected, and by whom or by what. This book is lengthy, atmospheric, and highly detailed. It reads like a classic, but is such a slow burn that I made it about 150 pages before I abandoned it. However, I am keeping my copy because I'm sure a day will come when I'm craving a long, slow read, at which time I will probably give this another go. Have you ever wanted to see a woman swim through a pool of alligators or witness a girl falling in love with a ghost? Because you can if you read Swamplandia by Karen Russell. This follows 13-year-old Ava Bigtree, whose family owns and operates a gator wrestling theme park in Florida called Swamplandia. When Ava's mother falls ill, the park's future is uncertain, a problem made worse by the opening of a rival park called the World of Darkness. After Ava's brother decides to work for the rival park and her sister runs off with a ghost, she sets out on a mission through the magical swamps to save her family. Now, this book has everything I tend to love about stories with magical realism, and yet I DNF'd it. Now, I think that comes down to bad timing, not the book itself. So if literary coming-of-age stories with hints of magical realism make your heart go pity-pat, then be sure to check this one out. This next book featured in my Best Books of 2024 video, Jamrach's Menagerie by Carol Birch. This is an epic adventure story of high stakes and high seas that opens with 8-year-old Jaffe Brown encountering an escaped tiger and reaching out to pet it. The tiger belongs to a famed importer of strange creatures named Charles Jamrach, who then employs Jaffe in his exotic menagerie. Now, this is after he gets the boy's head out of the tiger's mouth. Now, Jaffe works alongside a golden-haired boy named Tim, who teeters on the edge of being a friend and a rival. Jaffe and Tim are teenagers when rumors surface of a dragon living on an island in the Dutch East Indies, so Jamrach recruits Jaffe and Tim to go capture the fabled dragon. The boys set off on a whaling ship, embarking on a seafaring adventure filled with creaking ships, humid islands, and thrashing monsters. Rendered in gorgeous prose, Jamrach's Menagerie is an unforgettable story of friendship, survival, and sacrifice that I cannot recommend highly enough, especially the audiobook. Do I even need to talk about The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern? I feel like everyone and their second cousin has already read this book. It was a massive hit when it came out. It bridges the divide between literary fiction and fantasy in the story of a circus of dreams that arrives without warning and is only open at night. It follows a multitude of characters, but primarily centers on 2 young magicians who are in competition with each other, but whoopsie, they fall in love. It's wildly imaginative, lyrically written, and now seems like a good time to mention that Penguin recently released a beautiful vintage quarter-bound classics edition of this book. Arabian myth and magic collide in G. Willow Wilson's romantic fantasy novel, Aleph the Unseen. This tells the story of a young Arab Indian hacker who shields people from surveillance in an unnamed Middle Eastern security state. His name is Aleph, and he's secretly in love with the daughter of a high-ranking family that's developing connections with members of the state's electronic security force. This is a force designated to finding and prosecuting people like Aleph. And when his security is breached, he's driven underground to evade them. Now, Aleph is already in heaps of trouble when he receives the secret book of the Jinn titled The 1001 Days. It's believed that this book holds the secret to reprogramming the entire world. To be in possession of this book is to hold unimaginable power. So, of course, Aleph's enemies, both human and Jinn, will do anything to obtain it. Reviews of this book are overwhelmingly positive, yet I struggle to connect with the story, in part because hard drives and cryptic text and malware and encoded networks just aren't my thing. But if you enjoy stories that weave hackers taking on Big Brother with the unseen world of spirits of fire and air, then Give this one a read. This next book follows a sociopathic little girl named Pearl. Reason She Goes to the Woods by Deborah K. Davies is a study in using beautiful, poetic prose to tell a story that is dark and disturbing. This coming-of-age narrative follows Pearl from childhood to adolescence and recounts her escaping turbulent family dynamics by fleeing to the woods. It's composed of short vignettes and is almost guaranteed to send chills down your spine. Pick this one up if you can stomach violent stories that dance a line between sensual and sinister. Once in a while, the Women's Prize longlist includes a book that's fun and silly. A prime example of this is The Table of Less Valued Knights by Marie Phillips. This comedic Arthurian romance opens with Sir Humphrey Duval. Now, he doesn't sit at King Arthur's prestigious round table. No. He holds a spot at the lowly Table of Less Valued Knights. King Arthur banned Humphrey from going on quests, so he hasn't left the castle in 15 years. But when a damsel named Elaine asks for his help, Humphrey sees his chance to reclaim his place at the round table, so he embarks on a quest to help Elaine, who has a few secrets of her own. And meanwhile, a young queen named Martha is fleeing from her hideous fiancé when a woman in the lake gives her a sword and tells her some news about her brother that completely alters her journey. Now, Martha and Humphrey's paths collide, entangling them in a rollicking adventure of giants, bumbling knights, naive unicorns, brave damsels, and some royal scallywags who are so fun to hate. This amusing romp through a medieval adventure was another delightful discovery on my quest to find the weirdest Women's Prize nominees. Give this one a read if you want to laugh and have some fun. Would you like to see the world through the eyes of a bee? Because you can with Laline Paull's marvelous book, The Bees. This is about an inquisitive little honeybee named Flora 717. She's prone to free thinking, which is frowned upon in her hive, yet in Flora's case, it allows her to move through her caste-structured hive in a way that no other bee has done before. As Flora moves from working in sanitation to the nursery and eventually outside as a forager, she draws nearer to learning the truth about the queen's inner sanctum. And when she breaks the most sacred law of all by having a child of her own, her instincts to serve the hive are overshadowed by a fierce maternal love. The Bees is a beautifully written exploration of social hierarchies, organized religion, and motherhood. I have read this book multiple times, and I encourage you to read it too. We've sort of come full circle with pigs now because a lovable pet pig named Krunk and a boy with a disfigured skull named Filbert join a traveling carnival in The Anatomist's Dream by Cleo Gray. Now, Filbert is born into poverty in 19th century Germany and has a photographic memory. He doesn't know his father's name, and his enlarged, tumorous head compels his mother to sadly abandon him. Fortunately, he joins the carnival and finds kinship among the assorted misfits there, like the fishman and the dancing dwarf, along with other freak show artists, magicians, and entertainers. Now, one day, Filbert meets a renowned craniometrist who examines his head, which kicks off a dark, perilous journey where Filbert finds chaos and tragedy at every turn. This book is a slow burn with visceral, sensory writing, but it's also a touching story of found family and personal growth. Naomi Alderman's electric novel, The Power, examines a world where women acquire a supernatural ability that shifts the balance of power between the sexes. In its exploration of gender politics, the book chronicles events across the globe, showing how women in countries with more freedoms lean on their power slowly, whereas women in more restrictive countries use their new ability to enact swift and sudden change. This is a story of female empowerment, yet one of its four protagonists is a guy, so we get varied perspectives of this global event. On top of which, the novel is bookended by thematically relevant chapters that plant us firmly in this world of speculative fiction in the most shocking way. If you haven't gotten around to this one yet, don't miss it. Heather O'Neill cordially invites you to the most provocative circus the world has ever seen in The Lonely Hearts Hotel. This book pairs magical realism with historical fiction in the story of two orphaned children born in the early 20th century. One is a boy named Pierrot, who's born blue and presumed dead. The other is a girl named Rose, who's named after the bright spots of red on her cheeks. But they grow up to be a prodigy pianist and a very talented dancer, and they dream of one day creating a sensational circus together. This story explores poverty, abuse, and addiction through its prostitutes, performers, gangsters, and clowns who all live in a glittering underworld. It's definitely a must-read if you're in the mood for something freakish and funny with a touch of sadness. Brace yourself for a velvety cream puff of a book. The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gowar is decadent historical fiction set in 19th century London and concerns a merchant named John Hancock, whose quiet life is upended when he's given a mermaid's corpse. All of London wants to see this marvelous creature, so John Hancock finds himself pulled from the city's seedy underbelly into the finest drawing rooms of high society, where he meets a gorgeous courtesan named Angelica Neal, who tasks John with finding her another mermaid. And when at last he does, this time it isn't dead. There are gorgeous glimpses of magical realism throughout this book, and the writing style is lush and transportive. Give this one a read if you enjoy stories of obsession, uncertainty, desire, and sensuality. The time has come to talk about a horny merman, which you will find in Melissa Broder's humorous novel, The Pisces. Now, this follows a woman named Lucy who's broken up with her boyfriend and goes to her sister's beachfront property in LA to dog sit for the summer. While there, she spots an attractive man sitting on the beach rocks at night and soon discovers that he's actually a merman. So of course, she has an intense, erotic relationship with him while also doing some more serious things like pondering the difference between love and lust and contemplating the meaning of life. Now, you can tell from page 1 that the writing in this book is bold. And you know that writing tip, Save the Cat, where you have your protagonist do something small and kind at the start of a book to demonstrate that they're a good person? Lucy is the antithesis of that. She is despicable, and disliking her with every fiber of my being is partly why reading this book was so fun. Broder clearly set out to write a heinous anti-hero, and she succeeded masterfully. The Pisces is appalling, sexy, and funny. If you want to be shocked and have some fun, give this one a read. In 2020, there wasn't really an outlier on the long list. The only nominee that sort of fits the bill is Gin Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Anapara, because it's about a 9-year-old boy named Jai who lives in India, loves watching reality police shows, and decides to put his own crime-solving skills to work when one of his classmates goes missing. Soon, more children go missing, and rumors abound that they've been taken by soul-snatching jinn. Now, this story is actually based on real events and a spate of disappearances in metropolitan India. And spoiler alert, there are no jinn in this book. They serve only to convey that the story is being told through the eyes of a child who doesn't yet know how horrible the world can be. Now, ultimately, this book aims to draw attention to the fact that an estimated 180 children go missing every day in India. So it's not really a weird book, but rather one that uses the idea of mythical creatures as a coping mechanism for its young protagonist. Magical realism and mythology flourish in Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is one of the few instances where an outlier actually won the prize, and this book is much loved by many readers. It tells the story of a man named Piranesi who lives in a house of infinite rooms and endless corridors where the walls imprison an ocean and waves lap against the staircases. Piranesi is undaunted by the ocean and spends his days exploring the labyrinthine house. As far as he knows, there's only one other person in the house, but then one day he discovers evidence that a third person is in the house. And the more he digs to uncover the truth, the more his reality unravels. With striking imagery and gorgeous prose, Piranesi invites you into a world of isolation and mystery. If you haven't read this book yet, I ask you, what are you waiting for? From 2022's nominees, I'll give a quick shout to Salt Lick by Lulu Allison because this dystopian novel includes a chorus of feral cows weighing in on human behavior, but the cows are barely in the book, so it's not that weird. A stranger premise can be found in Ruth Ozeki's The Book of Form and Emptiness, which follows a 14-year-old boy named Benny who can hear the voices of his mother's hoarded items and eventually meets the book itself, which is telling his story. But my favorite weird nominee from that year is Creatures of Passage by Morowa Yejidé, otherwise known as one of the authors I was thrilled to discover as part of this reading project. This is one of those books that weaves several disparate threads together until it arrives at a jaw-dropping conclusion. It takes readers from the foggy streets of 1970s Washington, D.C. to the fiery realms of the underworld. It follows a woman who ferries passengers in a car with a ghost in its trunk, tracks a murdered man through the underworld, trails a boy who sees ghosts, and tells the story of a community haunted by the worst sort of predator. It's a story crafted with lurid prose that uses magical realism and African mythology to explore the legacy of violence, poverty, and racism in America. It's another book that made this whole weird reading journey totally worthwhile. If literary ghost stories are your thing, then there's a good chance you'll love this book. Laline Paull once again explores the world through different eyes in Pod. This extraordinary novel takes readers to the ocean's depths to explore how aquatic life is increasingly plagued by the ignorance and cruelty of the human race. It follows myriad creatures, but primarily focuses on a pack of spinner dolphins whose home waters are being destroyed by humans. One of the dolphins, named Aya, is forced to leave the pod and venture into the ocean's vast waters where predators lurk and demonic noises pierce the depths. Now, through her story and others, we're confronted with questions about climate change, military practices, gender fluidity, sexual violence, and more. And one thing I really appreciate about this book is how it explores difficult subject matter like SA, but by telling the story through animals, it puts us at a slight remove, and that distance allows some people to engage with these issues, whereas it otherwise might be too difficult a subject to approach. Pod is a beautiful, brutal, and potent reminder that we owe it to each other and ourselves to cherish the world we all live in. Talking animals have a thing or two to say about authoritarian government in Glory by No Violet Bulawayu. In the way that George Orwell's Animal Farm satirized the Russian Revolution and Stalinism, Glory interrogates political upheaval in Zimbabwe with the use of anthropomorphized animals. Now, it tells a story of censorship and oppression, rigged election and genocide, betrayal and ruin as these animals strive for liberation. I will admit that this book was a DNF for me, but I have heard great things about the audiobook, so I may revisit it at a later date. In recent years, we've seen an increasing number of fantastic books hitting shelves that explore how being a mother can push a person to the brink of insanity. And no book on that subject that I've read has done that in a stranger way than And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. Now, this story follows an Indigenous woman named Alice who lives with her husband in a white Toronto neighborhood where she's struggling with postpartum psychosis. Now, Alice can hear birds and squirrels talking to her. Trees communicate with her by putting images in her mind. And as a struggling new mother and the only Indigenous person in her neighborhood, she's lonely, and a voice inside her house starts telling her she doesn't belong there. As if that's not strange enough, I have two words for you. Talking cockroach. Yep, his name is Pete, and he can be found inside this book. Now, Alice's reality parallels the Haudenosaunee creation story of Sky Woman, and the result is a surreal story about mental illness, racism, and generational trauma. We are ending on a high note with another book from my Best Books of 2024 video, In Defense of the Act by Effie Black. This darkly comedic debut novel follows a middle-aged scientist who secretly believes that the act of unaliving oneself can be beneficial in certain circumstances. She works as an evolutionary psychobiologist, so she sees acts of self-termination play out with some regularity in her work, and she allows this to justify her taboo belief. She also has personal experience with people in her life unaliving themselves, and we get to know how and why they ended their lives over the course of the book. I know this sounds like a depressing book, and at times it is very sad, but it's also wry and funny and discusses a difficult subject from an unorthodox angle. Is it a weird little book? Yes, but it's also one of the best weird nominees put forth by the Women's Prize, so I implore you to treat yourself to a copy and read it. And that brings us to the end of this long, wild literary journey on which I embarked because I am a masochist, apparently, or because I just love weird stories. I like when authors are playful with their work, take risks, or explore stories from an unusual perspective or place. When I first discovered the Women's Prize for Fiction, I would have never thought there'd be so many weird books to explore, but now I see that the prize has a long history of including an outlier, so I'm happy to say there's a good chance future longlists will offer me and you more weird books to enjoy. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you happy reading, and I'll see you in the next one.